took a trip on the train, and I thought about you. I passed a shadowy lane, and I thought about you. 2 or 3 cars parked under the stars, a winding street.
All right. Thank you for coming this morning. We're going to start with Polka Dots and Moo Mews. A song that goes back to 1939.
Would you care to hear the strangest story? At least it may be strange to you. If you saw it in a moving picture, you would say it couldn't be true.
2, 3, 4.
A country dance was being held in a garden. I felt a bump and heard an "oh, beg your pardon." Suddenly I saw polka dots and moonbeams all around Apollo Street. The music started, and was I the perplexed one? I held my breath and said, "May I have the next one?" In my frightened arms, polka dots past a shadowy lane, and I thought about you. 2 or 3 cars parked under the stars, a winding street, moon shining down on some little town, and with each beat, same old tree. At every stop that we
Kisa Gotami was a young woman from a prosperous family, and she was happily married to a wealthy man. A son was born to them, and Kisa Gotami loved her son with all her heart. But this son fell ill and died suddenly when he was only a toddler. Kisa Gotami was stricken with grief. Her heart was broken. She wept for days on end. She could not endure the death of her only beloved child. Weeping constantly and near collapse, she took the body of her dead child and went everywhere asking for medicine to restore her son to life. People thought she had gone mad, but a wise man, seeing her pathetic condition, decided to send her to the Buddha. "Sister," he said, "the Buddha is the person you should see. He has the medicine you want. Go to him." Thus, she went to the Buddha and asked him to give her the medicine that would restore her dead son to life. The Buddha listened with patience and compassion. Then he told her, "There is a way to solve your problem. Please go and find me 4 or 5 mustard seeds from any family in which there has never been a death." Overjoyed at the prospect of having her son restored to life, Kisa Gotami ran from house to house, begging for some mustard seeds. Everyone was willing to help, but she could not find a single home where death had not occurred. "Kisa Gotami, I can give you mustard seeds, but I have lost a daughter." "Kisa Gotami, please take these seeds, but I have lost my brother." "Kisa Gotami, you are welcome to all that I have, but my mother died 10 days ago." Again and again, people were only too willing to part with their mustard seeds, but no one could claim to have never lost a loved one to death. As the day dragged on, she realized hers was not the only family that had faced death, and that there were far more people dead than living. Suddenly, she understood what the Buddha had wanted her to discover for herself, that suffering is a part of life, and death comes to us all. When Kisa Gotami accepted the fact that death is inevitable, she slowly began to return to her life. She took her beloved child's body away, burying her son and mourning her loss. She returned to the Buddha, dry-eyed and empty-handed, and told him that she could find no family where death had not occurred. Then the Buddha said, "Kisa Gotami, now you know that you are not the only one who has lost a son. As you now realize, death comes to all beings. Long before our desires are fulfilled, death takes us away."
Thank you, John. I like the phrase, she appeared before the Buddha, dry-eyed and empty-handed. So I'm going to tell the third story of the morning, which I believe comes out of the Muslim tradition. It's called the story of the pious man. So there was a pious man, a farmer, a successful farmer, living centuries ago, and one day the angel of death appeared and said to him, "It's your time." And the pious man said, "Well, if it's God's will, then God's will be done. But for mercy's sake, I have 3 daughters. And my first daughter she's a bit of a simpleton. And I'd like to see her happily married before I die. And I wonder if I might be spared just to see that she's married." And the angel of death thought for a minute. He thought, "Well, I can give you a challenge. And if you successfully pass the challenge, then we'll assume it's God's will that you live a bit longer to see your daughter." So he said, the angel of death said, "Let me ask you a question." He said, what gift did your mother leave by your head on the side of your pillow in your bed when you were 2 years old? If you can answer me that, you'll be spared." And then the angel of death went away and said he'd be back the next day. And so the man thought and thought, and he went to bed, and he couldn't imagine, what the gift was. And he woke up the next morning, and he still didn't know the answer, and he was tending to his goats. and he was feeding them and so forth. And he asked the goats, he lamented to the goats, I don't know the answer to this question, and death will come today, and I'm just in despair. And the goats loved the man because he had always taken care of them and delivered their babies and taken the burrs out of their fur. And they said, oh, well, we know the answer to that question. Your mother left a hyacinth on your pillow when you were 2 years old. So later that day, death arrives, and the man answers, it was a hyacinth. And death praises God and disappears. And the man lives to help his oldest daughter find a simple but honest man, and they marry, and they live happily, and the man rejoices that he got to see his oldest daughter marry. And I feel compelled to do a little digression at this point. So this story comes from an era when the main thing about having daughters was getting them married. So work with me here. We know today that that's not the primary concern of parents of daughters. We know that daughters can, be astronauts and lawyers and soldiers and chief justices and all kinds of wonderful things. In the United States, they apparently can't be president yet. We're not ready for that. We're not grown up enough for that yet. Maybe we'll get there, but most other occupations are available to young women today. So I digress. Let me go back to my story. So the angel of death appears a second time, sometime later, and he says, your time has come. And the man says, if it's God's will, so be it. But I have a second daughter, and she's kind of plain. And I'd really like to see her get married before I die. I'm a little worried that she'll find no husband. And the angel of death says, well, if you can answer this question, it must be God's will that you live. Let me ask you a second question. When you were 1 year old, what did your mother place in your mouth? And death disappears, death goes away, and he thinks about it and thinks about it, and he doesn't know. How do you remember what happened to you when you were 1 year old? And the next morning, he's taking care of his horses. He turns them out in the paddock, and he laments to his horses, I don't know, death will be coming today, and I don't know the answer to the question. And the horses say, oh, well, we know the answer to that question. Your mother placed a bit of boiled quail egg in your mouth when you were 1 year old. Sure enough, later that day, death appears, and the man answers the question, a bit of boiled quail egg, and the death praises God and disappears. And the man gets to see his second daughter married to a plain and simple man, but they're married happily, and the man rejoices. You know where this is going. Time goes by. Death appears a third time. Says, it's your time. The man says, I have a third daughter, and she's smart and beautiful, and I'm sure she'll marry well, but I really would like to live to see her marry. And death says, well, if you can answer me this question, you'll be able to live. What did your mother whisper into your ear on the day that you were born? And the man, he doesn't know. He goes to bed, he's thinking about it, he wakes up in the morning, and he can't think. How are you supposed to remember what the very first words that your mother said to you on the day you were born? And he's feeding the chickens, and he asks the chickens, do you know? The horses knew, and the goats knew. The chickens know, and as everybody knows, chickens are kind of stupid. So they don't have any answer for him. They're just, just pecking the ground. And he's in despair. And to make matters worse, death arrives even earlier that day. He arrives later on in the morning, and he says, well, do you have an answer? And the man, his eyes are downcast. He doesn't know. And death says, do you have an answer? If not, you must come with me. And the man looks up with tears in his eyes, and he looks at death and he says, only, I did not know that you would come so soon. And death says, God be praised, and disappears. For those were indeed the words that the man's mother whispered into his ear on the very moment that he was born. And so the man saw his third daughter married, and there was a big celebration, and he lived for many years in the blessings of his daughter and the bounty of his many grandchildren. Thank you. That was a new number called You Came Along, and it was written by Phil Myers. And I'd like to do a shout out to Phil, who is here in the audience this morning. Phil, would you please stand up? Phil's a local jazz composer. And we're always pleased to debut Phil's new songs. Phil wrote this fall of last year, right? 2018. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone. So, Ecclesiastes chapter and verse 9:11, no less, reminds everyone that time and chance happeneth to them all. Our lives are filled with so much luck, both good and bad, more than we care to admit. Yet each of us can tell a coherent life story. Things happen to us, and then we make sense of what happened to us. We build a story around a sequence of inherently disconnected events. So, the randomness of life. Your niece gets pregnant, and 21 months later, her son is the ring bearer at the wedding of her and her son's dad. Your healthy, robust father is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's and dies before his 64th birthday. You get a phone call out of the blue, say yes, and your career changes for the better in ways you couldn't have possibly imagined. Your son suddenly becomes mentally ill. A distant uncle dies and remembers you in his will. Your wife develops pancreatic cancer and is dead 15 months later. You attend a party you were going to skip, meet someone, fall in love together, and marry within a year. As Phil's song title succinctly says, you came along and everything changed. All these events I just mentioned have happened to me or to people close to me. One story leads to another and another. The stories we tell condition the stories we can tell. Or, as the author David Trier put it, The ways in which we tell the story of our reality shapes that reality. The manner of telling makes the world both conceptually and actually. On the conceptual side, it's, this is what happened, this is how it made me feel, and this is what it meant to me. Last year, I reread Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and I highly recommend it. But this time I found I had a slight quarrel with him, with the whole idea that meaning was something out there, something we seek. I don't believe meaning is in any way external or extrinsic. I believe we make meaning in our minds and hearts, and then embody it in the world. Meanwhile, when we encounter instances of embodied meaning made by others, we interpret those markers and in so doing, recreate meaning, again within. Of course, frighteningly, if meaning is something that's made, created, then it is also something that can be destroyed. For example, between 507 and 554 AD, the faithful carved two giant, gorgeous Buddha statues into the sandstone cliffs at Bamiyan in Afghanistan. In 2001, the Taliban dynamited those statues, turning them into dust. Meaning makers and meaning destroyers. It seems strange to me that Frankl didn't acknowledge this. Take the central example of his book, The Nazi Death Camps. The Shoah said to the Jew, the gypsy, the gay person, the disabled, and the misfit, you do not matter. You have no story worth remembering. You're just a tattooed number. Since then, we have erected memorials to the victims of the Shoah, conducted rituals and ceremonies of remembrance. Acts such as these say, your lives did matter. You did not live in vain. We recreate the meaning, the mattering that the Nazis tried to destroy. We tell a new story, a better story. Of course, it's not just actual stories, but any human endeavor that has narrative potential. We make meaning through poetry, music, painting, and as I mentioned, sculpture. And I don't mean to limit my examples only to art. Building a business, healing a sick person, teaching a child, and so on. All start new stories, forging and renewing meaning. But these acts and activities are meaningful because of the meaning that we give them and because we tell others about, that is, share that meaning. The sharing is very important. If you did something that left no trace, sang alone to the stars, danced solitary in the pouring rain, lay yourself face down on the earth and wept in the dark, and you told absolutely no one, wouldn't you come in time to doubt that it really had happened? Did I do it or dream it? We need a friend to tell us, oh yeah, you told me about that. You were a little crazy back then. There are also larger stories that we tell, giant narratives. We believe in some comprehensive fictions, not falsehoods per se, but systems of meaning that we collectively accept. Three good examples are money, religion, and country. Money doesn't seem particularly fictitious. $100 buys $100 worth of stuff. Or at least it does until hyperinflation comes along, which is just another way of saying that the collective fiction has collapsed. No one accepts the story anymore, and $100 is suddenly worthless. A $100 bill becomes a green rectangular piece of paper with printing on it, which is what it really is after all. Its meaning has evaporated. How about religion? I've noticed that today, no one worships the gods on Mount Olympus. The Greek story grew old and ceased to be a living tale. Then those that come after call it myth or fiction. But I enjoy reading about the adventures of Zeus and Hera and Apollo and the rest, and find those stories meaningful in a different way. Now we can see the same thing starting with Christianity. Imagine Christianity in 1,000 years. Already, even the grand cathedrals of Europe are visited more by tourists than parishioners. There are more museums than houses of worship. What is God but just the greatest story we've ever told ourselves, our most enduring fairy tale? The God story is a story I believe in. It doesn't have to be true. To ask whether it's true is to ask the wrong question. It only has to be meaningful. Turning to country, we see how people will even lay down their lives for a story, a narrative that makes sense to them, that they invest with meaning. Hence, when 13 colonies rebel against the crown to start a new nation, the British send in the troops. Regardless, in 1776, a new story began and took hold. Later, during the American Civil War, the South tried to change the narrative again. But the Confederate States of America ended up being a rather short story, one only 51 months long. A handful of people still try to fly its flag, but face backlash from the majority of Americans saying, "That's not the story we want to tell. That's not who we are." Which leads to my final point about the stories we tell. Stories form our identity. I've been meditating for over 2 years now under the guidance of Andrew Puttycombe. Andrew says that mindfulness is important because it makes us aware of the stories we tell ourselves over and over and over to shore up our shaky sense of self. What's fascinating is that this need causes us to cling to even painful narratives about our past that we would be better off without. Let me share a personal example. I was out for a walk not too long ago on a simply beautiful day, but I wasn't enjoying my surroundings or the present moment. I was rehearsing really, a painful memory from when I was about 13 years old. My God, that was 50 years ago. And then I had a moment of mindfulness. Remember, I've been meditating. And I thought, why am I holding on to this? It shouldn't mean anything anymore. After all, most things just happen to us. And I let it go. It felt like freedom. It was an opening, a chance to write a new story. Abandon an unhappy narrative about yourself and watch what happens. There are facts. There are narratives about the facts. There are things that happen. And there are ways that we stitch together those events to tell a tale. I believe the material world itself is meaningless in the best sense of that word. It is our palette, our playground, the page on which we write the story of our lives. Out of the raw materials of life, we make meaning, saying, this matters, I matter, we matter. I'll close with the Virginian poet Gregory Orr, who put it beautifully in only 70 words. This is what was bequeathed us, the earth the beloved left, and leaving left to us. No other world but this one, willows and the river and the factory with its black smokestacks. No other shore, only this bank on which the living gather. No meaning but what we find here, no purpose but what we make. That and the beloved's clear instructions. Turn me into story or song. Sing me awake. I'd like to invite our newest band member, Lindsay Lozeau, up to tell a story from the Christian tradition, and we're very happy to have Lindsay. She's been with us since the beginning of the year as our new trumpeter. Lindsay.
Edges and Whispers. Once there was an old man who lived in a tiny village. Although poor, he was envied by all, for he owned a beautiful white horse, majestic, splendid, and strong. People offered fabulous prices for the steed, but the man always refused. "This horse is not a horse to me. He is a friend, not a possession. How could you sell a friend?" The temptation was great, but he never sold the horse. One morning, he found that the horse was not in the stable. All the village came to see him. "You old fool," they scoffed. "We warned that you would be robbed. How could you ever hope to protect such a valuable animal? It would have been better if you had sold him. You could have gotten whatever price you wanted, but now you've been cursed with misfortune." The old man responded, "Don't speak too quickly. All we know is that the horse is not in the stable. The rest is judgment. If I've been cursed, how can you know? How can you judge? The people contested, we may not be philosophers, but great philosophy is not needed. The simple fact is that your horse is gone, and that's a curse. The old man spoke again. All I know is that the stable is empty and the horse is gone. The rest I don't know. I can't say whether it be a curse or a blessing. All we see is a fragment. Who can say what will come next? The people of the village laughed. They always thought the man a fool. If he weren't, he would have sold the horse. But instead, he was a poor woodcutter, living hand to mouth in the misery of poverty. The man's horse returned after 15 days, having run away into the forest, and brought back with him a dozen wild horses. Once again, the people gathered around the man, saying, "Old man, you were right, we were wrong. What we thought was a curse was indeed a blessing." The man responded, "Once again, you go too far. Say only that the horse is back, and with a dozen more horses, but don't judge. How can you know if this is a blessing or not? You see only a fragment. Life is so vast, yet you judge all of life with one page or one word. No one knows. Be content with what you know and not perturbed by what you don't." "Maybe the old man is right," they said to one another, so they said little. But down deep, they knew it was a blessing. The man now had 12 more horses. The animals could be broken and trained and sold for so much more money. The old man had only one son, who began to train the wild horses. And after a few days, he fell from one of them and broke both legs. Once again, the villagers gathered around the old man and cast their judgments. "You were right," they said. "You proved that you were right. The dozen horses were not a blessing. They were a curse. Your only son has broken his legs, and now in your old age you have no one to help you. Now you are even poorer than ever." The old man spoke again. "Don't go so far. Say only that my son broke his legs. Who knows if it's a blessing or a curse? No one knows. We can only have a fragment. Life comes in fragments." A few weeks later, the country engaged in war. All the young men of the village were required to join the army. Only the son of the old man was excluded because he was injured. Once again, the people gathered, crying because their sons had been taken with little chance that they would return. The enemy was strong. They might never see their sons again. "You were right, old man," they wept. "God knows you were right. This proves it. Your son's accident was a blessing. His legs may be broken, but at least he is with you. Our sons are gone forever." The old man spoke again. "Say only this. Your sons go to war, and mine did not. No one knows if it's a blessing or a curse. No one knows. Only God knows." The old man was right. We only have a fragment. Life's mishaps and horrors are only a page out of a single grand book. We must be slow about drawing conclusions. We must reserve judgment until we know the whole story.
As kind of a musical meditation, another song that tells a story. And if it's okay with the congregation, I'd like to dedicate this song to my wife, Peggy. I've grown accustomed to her face. She almost makes the day begin. I've grown accustomed to the tune she whistles night and noon. Her smiles, her frowns, her ups, her downs are second nature to me now. Like breathing out and breathing in.
He was serenely independent and content before we met. Surely he could always
She's accustomed to her ways, accustomed to her I've grown accustomed to her face. She almost makes the day begin. I've gotten used to hear her say good morning every day. Her joys, her lows, her highs are second nature to me now. Like breathing out and breathing in. I'm very grateful she's a woman and so easy to forget.
Rather like a habit one can always break, and yet I've grown accustomed to the trace of something in the air, accustomed to her face. Life again. Out of the dusk, a shadow, then a spark. Out of the cloud, a silence, then a lark. Out of the heart, a rapture, then a pain. Out of the dead, cold ashes, life again. The way you wear your hat, the way you sip your tea, the memory of all that. No, no, they can't The way you wear your hat, the way you sip your tea, the memory of all that. No, no, they can't take that away from me. The way your smile just beams, the way you sing off key, the way you haunt my dreams. No, no, they can't take that away from me. We may never, never meet again on the bumpy road to love. Still, I'll always, always keep the memory of the way you hold your knife, the way we danced till 3, the way you changed my life. No, no, they can't take that away from me. No, they can't take that away from. They can't take that away from. No, they can't take that away from me.
Thank you, Sarah. And since it's springtime, we're going to do Up Jump Spring by Freddie Hubbard. It is springtime. It is coming. Thank you. Happy spring.
I took a trip on the train and I thought about you. I passed a shadowy lane and I thought about you. 2 or 3 cars